The shadow of the sycamore tree, twisted and dry like a severed root, fell across Elias's sandals as he stood before the cold, dark stone of Marcus the moneylender's fortified house. This was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. The air itself seemed heavy with the dust of failed harvests and the crushing weight of interest, compounding daily like a slow, deliberate poison. Elias felt the parchment hidden inside his tunic, the final demand signed with Marcus's brutally efficient seal, a seal that promised not just the confiscation of his last few parcels of olive grove, but the terrifying prospect of selling his own children into temporary servitude to settle the largest portion of the debt. It was a choice no father should ever have to make, yet here he stood, the sun climbing higher, burning away the last wisps of morning hope. Just 6 years ago, Elias had been a man of substance in Bethany, known for the purity of his oil and the generosity of his table. Now he was a hollowed vessel, haunted by the specter of ruin. The debt had started innocently enough, a necessary investment in a new cistern when the rains failed 3 seasons in a row. But the rains failed again. And then a mysterious blight took hold of the oldest trees, the ones that sustained his family for generations. Every attempt to recoup his losses, every panicked loan he took from Marcus to cover the last, only tightened the noose of servitude. He had prayed, he had fasted, he had worked his hands raw until they bled, yet the numbers on the ledger only mocked his effort. The most devastating realization, the one that truly stripped him bare, was the knowledge that his desperation had led him to abandon the spiritual truths his father had taught him. The simple, radical trust in Yahweh's provision. Instead, he trusted the shifting sands of commerce and the brittle promises of men like Marcus, whose compassion was as scarce as water in the Negev. Elias lifted his hand, his knuckles trembling, ready to strike the heavy bronze knocker, but froze. He could not do it. He could not walk in and sacrifice his daughter Miriam, whose laugh was like the chime of temple bells, or his young son Johanna, whose eyes held the pure, unquestioning faith Elias himself had lost. He pulled his hand back as if burned. A sudden fierce wave of nausea swept over him. This was the end. The choice wasn't between his children, but between facing Marcus and facing the desolate wilderness. And in that terrifying moment of absolute finality, Elias made his choice. He turned his back on the looming edifice of greed and debt and began to walk, not toward home, but toward the dusty road leading out of Bethany, heading east, toward the unforgiving Judean hills, seeking only silence and, perhaps, oblivion. The road felt like a treadmill, each step forward only emphasizing the futility of his flight. As Elias walked, the memory of prosperity, once a source of comfort, became a cruel taunt. He vividly recalled the day his father, old Joseph, had handed him the keys to the oil storehouse, his hands smelling perpetually of crushed olives and sun-warmed stone. Joseph had not given him a sermon on profit, but on purity. "Elias," his father had said, his voice raspy but firm, "the oil is not just trade, it is stewardship. When the oil is pure, our hands are clean, and our hearts remain open to the true provider. Never let the craving for more overshadow the gratitude for what is provided." Elias had nodded, secure in his youthful confidence, certain that his own cleverness and ambition would multiply his inheritance tenfold. and for a time they did. He expanded the trade routes, secured contracts with Roman garrisons, and introduced new, faster presses. He confused efficiency with blessing. The turning point was subtle, hidden beneath layers of false confidence. When the first drought struck, instead of relying on the community's shared faith and patience, Elias panicked. He borrowed heavily from Marcus to dig a deeper, private well, promising returns based on a harvest that never fully materialized. He then compounded the error, pouring the borrowed money into a vast, unproven tract of land far south, convinced that its cheaper price would offset the increased transport costs. This was the gamble that broke him. Marcus, ever watchful, calculated the interest not on Elias's real assets, but on his desperate potential, setting traps of variable rates and penalty clauses disguised in verbose legal language. Elias, blinded by ambition and fear, signed them all. He realized now that his father's warning wasn't about business ethics, it was about the dangerous idolatry of money. He had meticulously calculated his assets, his liabilities, his expected yields, but he had utterly failed to factor in the unpredictable hand of God, or the simple fact that true wealth lay not in the fullness of the cistern, but in the peace of the soul. As the sun beat down, Elias found a momentary resting place beneath an ancient rock overhang, pulling out the small, hard loaf of stale bread he had brought. He looked at the bread, dry and tasteless, and understood that he hadn't just lost his business, he had lost his identity. The shame was a physical affliction, heavier than the debt. He was the man who had failed his father, failed his family, and worst of all, failed his covenant. The prosperity was a dream. The debt was a harsh, unforgiving reality. And the path ahead now was nothing but bare rock and dust. The journey into the wilderness was not one of pilgrimage, but of deliberate self-exile. Elias walked until the sight of the cultivated fields and the smoke from the village kitchens were lost behind the curvature of the dry hills. He craved isolation, believing that the emptiness of the desert would match the desolation within his spirit. He had to extinguish the memory of Miriam's hopeful face and Johanna's inquisitive gaze. He felt unworthy to carry their faces in his mind. The physical hardships began immediately. The sparse, thorny scrub offered little shade. His water skin, carelessly filled in his panicked rush, was half empty by noon, and the relentless heat began to warp his thoughts, blending reality with feverish despair. He was no desert traveler. He was a soft man of the market, accustomed to comfort. He realized the irony. He was fleeing potential servitude to a man, only to become a slave to hunger and thirst. In the dizzying afternoon heat, he stumbled upon a narrow wadi, dry as bone, realizing that if the rains had not come for the trees, they certainly wouldn't come for him here. He sank down onto the cracked earth, allowing the hopelessness to wash over him fully. He wasn't looking for salvation, he was looking for surrender. His spiritual crisis was stark and immediate. Where was the God of Abraham, the God who provided manna in the wilderness? Elias had been told these were parables of power, stories meant to inspire belief. But when you are facing the literal collapse of your entire world, when the threat of slavery is real and immediate, those ancient tales feel distant and impossibly grand. They felt like stories for giants, not for failed olive merchants. He cried out, a raw, strangled sound echoing off the silent rocks, demanding a sign, demanding intervention. Why had God allowed the blights, the droughts, the avarice of Marcus to succeed? Was his sin of misplaced trust so enormous that it warranted the destruction of his innocent children's future? He felt a desperate urge to tear up the ground, to rage against the very soil that had refused to yield its bounty. The hours crawled by, marked only by the shifting shadows of the desolate peaks. As the cool relief of twilight arrived, bringing with it the intense chill of the desert night, Elias felt his strength fading. He lay down, pulling his cloak tightly around him, expecting this lonely, barren place to be his tomb. He prayed a final, desperate prayer, not of supplication, but of accusation, a final broken plea for understanding before the deep, cold sleep took him. The freezing bite of the pre-dawn air jarred Elias awake. But what truly startled him was not the cold, but the smell of wood smoke and roasting barley. He pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and aching, his eyes gritty with fatigue, and saw a faint glow emanating from around the bend in the wadi. Cautiously, driven by the sheer animal instinct of hunger, he crept toward the light. He found a small makeshift camp sheltered between two large boulders, a sight utterly unexpected in this forsaken region. Beside a tiny, carefully constructed fire sat an old man, cloaked in heavy sheepskin, his face weathered into deep lines that spoke of sun and wind, but his eyes held a serene, almost detached tranquility. He was a shepherd of the most humble and solitary kind, tending a small flock of exceptionally healthy sheep grazing nearby on the scant, dew-moistened scrub. The shepherd, whose name Elias later learned was Micah, looked up not with surprise, but with quiet expectation. "Come, traveler," Micah said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You are late for the morning meal, but there is enough." Elias, embarrassed by his ragged appearance and overwhelming stench of failure, hesitated. Micah simply motioned to a small bowl of porridge simmering over the coals. Elias ate ravenously, gulping down the food without ceremony, the warmth spreading through his frozen core. When he finished, Micah offered him a small cup of water. Elias drank slowly, finally able to meet the shepherd's eyes. He felt compelled to confess his situation, the debt, the deadline, the children. He poured out the story of his ruin, expecting pity or advice on where to flee next. Micah listened patiently, occasionally nodding, never interrupting. When Elias was done, breathless and weeping with the shame of his admission, Micah remained silent for a long moment. He didn't offer money. He didn't offer legal advice. He didn't offer a miracle cure. He only offered a deep, profound truth wrapped in the simplest words. He looked toward his small, contented flock and then back at Elias. "The debt you owe Marcus is great, my son, but the greatest debt is the one you owe to your own peace. You have forgotten the shepherd." Elias scoffed weakly. What good is a parable of a shepherd when Roman law holds the scales and the ledger is written in ink? Micah smiled, a slow, sad expression. "The ledger of man is fleeting, but the covenant of God endures. You speak of money and interest. I speak of want. Do you truly lack anything right now?" Elias looked at the remaining porridge, the warmth of the fire, the clean water. For this moment, no. "And how did this moment of provision arrive?" Micah asked gently. "You fled, you despaired, yet the provision met you on the rocks. Why? Because the provider is constant, even when we are faithless. Listen to this, and let it be the payment for your anxiety, for it is the only true currency." Micah then began to recite the ancient words, simple and rhythmic, words that Elias had heard since childhood, but which now resonated with a terrifying, absolute clarity. It was the Psalm of the Shepherd, spoken not as poetry, but as a living command, a radical declaration of trust. He listened, and for the first time in months, the churning storm in his soul stilled. He realized the psalm was not a plea for wealth, but a cure for worry. Micah told him, "Repeat this not for coin, but for sanity. Repeat it once a day with absolute faith, and watch how the definitions of want change."
Elias spent the remainder of the day with Micah, not discussing market prices or legal maneuvering, but discussing the nature of trust. He helped the shepherd with the simple chores, finding a strange, humbling relief in the rhythm of non-monetary labor. He had been a master merchant, but he was clumsy at gathering firewood and herding sheep. Yet Micah treated him with unwavering respect. As the sun set, staining the western ridges a brilliant crimson, Elias repeated the psalm again, this time by memory. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He focused on the finality of that declaration, "I shall not want." It wasn't a hopeful wish, it was a factual statement, applicable even when his house was hours away from seizure. But the human mind, conditioned by years of counting silver and dreading ledgers, fought fiercely against this radical simplicity. His heart whispered, "You shall not want, Elias, but you want freedom from debt. You want your daughter's safety. You want the dignity you've lost." The internal battle was exhausting. He realized that the psalm required a terrifying act of spiritual surrender, the acknowledgement that his own power, his intellect, his hard work had utterly failed him, and that the only remaining pathway was one of complete reliance on an unseen hand. It was easier to fight Marcus than to fight his own pride. Yet the memory of Micah's peaceful face and the warmth of the provided porridge held fast. He realized the psalm wasn't meant to magically produce a bag of gold. It was meant to give him the strength to face the abyss without breaking, knowing that even in the valley of the shadow of death, provision exists. He wrestled with the choice. Should he stay in the wilderness, allowing his family to face the consequences of his failure in his absence? Or should he return, possessing nothing but this fragile new trust? The answer, he realized, was clear. Trust must be tested in the furnace of reality. It required him to walk back into the lion's den. He stood up, feeling a strange lightness he hadn't known since his youth. He still had no plan, no silver, no leverage, but he had the psalm. If you too have faced a wall so tall that human strength cannot possibly surmount it, whether it is debt, grief, or despair, what was the moment you realized you had to stop trying to control the situation and finally surrender to faith? Share your experience in the comments below. Was it terrifying, or was it the greatest relief imaginable? Elias knew his relief was terrifying because it meant trusting God even with Marcus's cruel indifference. He bid farewell to the kind shepherd, promising to remember his lesson more than his charity. He turned his face westward, back toward Bethany, back toward the judgment, carrying nothing but a small empty water skin and a heart beginning to fill with the ancient melody of absolute provision. His feet, previously dragging with defeat, now moved with a purpose fueled not by hope of escape, but by acceptance of his fate, guided by the assurance that the shepherd was leading him, even through the darkest valley.
The journey back to Bethany took a day and a half, fueled by determination and the steady repetition of the psalm, which he now recited both internally and in hushed tones whenever he felt the terror creep back. He had to remind himself constantly, "I shall not want." When he arrived late on the third evening, the familiar sight of his small house, dark and silent, nearly broke him. He crept inside, bracing himself for the anger and fear he knew he deserved. His wife, Leah, was sitting by the hearth, stoking the dying embers, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. When she saw him, safe but clearly broken, she did not rush to him with accusations or tears. Instead, a wave of profound relief washed over her features, quickly followed by fear. "Elias, they came," she whispered, her voice strained. "Marcus's men. They said if you did not appear by noon tomorrow, they would take possession of the storage house and begin the inventory of the household goods. They asked for Miriam." Elias watched his wife's face contort in pain at the mention of their daughter's name. Leah had been managing the house and shielding the children while he was lost in self-pity. He moved toward her, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair, smelling the familiar scent of wood smoke and lavender, a scent that represented the stability he had nearly destroyed. "Leah, I was gone. I was lost in my own shadow. Forgive me," he murmured. He told her about the wilderness, about the shepherd, and about the psalm. He spoke not of a miraculous intervention, but of a complete change of perspective. Leah listened, her practical mind struggling to reconcile his newfound peace with the immediate, cold reality of the debt collector's demand. "Elias," she said softly, pulling back to look into his eyes, "peace does not pay Marcus's bond. Tomorrow we lose everything. We must fight." "We will face him together," Elias replied, his voice calm, startling even himself. "But we will face him not as defeated men, but as children of provision. We have nothing left to lose but our faith, and that is what I intend to keep." The children, Miriam and Jokana, awoke and rushed in, clinging to their father, their confusion momentarily forgotten in the joy of his return. They discussed the last remaining valuable, a heavy silver menorah that had belonged to Joseph's grandmother, a piece they had sworn never to sell. Leah suggested selling it immediately, perhaps buying a week's grace. Elias shook his head. "No, I will not approach Marcus with fear or bargaining chips. I will approach him tomorrow at noon, empty-handed, but with full trust." That night, Elias held his family close, repeating the psalm aloud until they drifted off to sleep. He knew that the dawn would bring the test, the crucible where his new faith would either solidify into rock or dissolve back into the dust of despair. The next morning was strangely quiet. Elias washed and dressed in his cleanest, though threadbare, tunic. He ate a small breakfast with his family, savoring the simple act of being together, understanding that this moment, the moment before the storm, was itself a gift of provision. As the clock approached the 11th hour, Elias kissed his wife and children goodbye, the finality of the act heavy in his chest, yet tempered by the internal rhythm of the psalm. He walked through Bethany, meeting the curious, often pitying glances of his former neighbors. He felt neither shame nor defiance, only a quiet resolve. When he reached Marcus's fortified house, the gate was open, but the atmosphere was unusual. Instead of the usual hurried, intimidating bustle of guards and ledger keepers, there was a strange tension, a forced silence. Marcus's chief accountant, a nervous man named Simon, met him at the door, his face pale with something other than debt collection urgency. "Elias," Simon stammered, "you're timely. Marcus is occupied." "I came to honor my word," Elias stated simply, stepping into the cool stone vestibule. The building, usually smelling of stale parchment and anxiety, now carried the sharper scent of expensive Roman perfume and something else: authority. Elias was ushered into Marcus's central counting room, a place of dread where deals were sealed and lives were ruined. But Marcus was not alone. Sitting opposite the moneylender, casually reviewing a stack of documents, was a Roman official of high rank, a man wearing the purple trim of a military procurator, surrounded by two stern legionaries. This was Lucius Valerius, known for his relentless efficiency in overseeing military logistics and taxation across the region. Marcus looked visibly agitated, beads of sweat tracking paths through the flour dusting his brow. He was clearly accustomed to intimidating local merchants, but entirely uncomfortable under the scrutinizing gaze of Roman power. Elias quickly understood. His arrival had coincided with an unexpected invasive audit of Marcus's affairs. Lucius looked up, his expression cold and analytical, and immediately dismissed the accountant. "Marcus," Lucius stated, his Latin crisp and commanding, "we have found discrepancies in your taxation records concerning the supply of high-grade olive oil for the garrison in Caesarea. You over-reported your costs while providing subpar quality. Who is this man? Is he involved in this fraudulent supply line?" Marcus, flustered, tried to brush Elias away. "He is irrelevant, Procurator. A small matter of settled local debt. Nothing that concerns Rome." But Elias, prompted by a sudden surge of strength, the strength that came from having truly nothing left to fear, spoke clearly in the rudimentary Latin he had learned during his years of market trading. "I am Elias of Bethany. My debt is large, but my oil was never subpar, Procurator. My father's olives were the finest in the region, and my integrity was known. It is my business, not my oil, that failed." Lucius Valerius, the procurator, found himself intrigued by the merchant's composure. The usual posture of a debtor before Marcus was one of frantic supplication or trembling fear. Elias displayed neither. He stood straight, dignified by his despair. Lucius leaned back in his chair, tapping his finger against the marble table. "Elias of Bethany," he repeated, studying the merchant. "I know that name. Several years ago, before I took this post, I recall my predecessor noting the quality of the oil supplied to the Jerusalem cohort. That supply ceased abruptly. It was exceptionally fine, pure, nearly crystalline. We were forced to move to lower-grade Sardinian oil, which tastes of salt and desperation. Marcus, did you absorb this man's operation?" Marcus squirmed, hating the spotlight. "His operation collapsed, Procurator. Natural failures. He owes me a substantial sum, a life debt." Lucius ignored Marcus and addressed Elias. "Tell me, merchant, why did your superior supply cease?" Elias explained his ruin: the drought, the blight, the high-interest contracts, the rapid descent into insolvency. He did not plead for mercy. He simply laid out the factual sequence of events, emphasizing that his failure was one of poor calculation and misplaced trust in market forces, not one of deliberate malfeasance or tainted product. He concluded with a quiet statement that resonated far beyond the counting room. "I came here today, Procurator, prepared to surrender everything, including my children, to fulfill the terms of the bond, because I will not break my covenant, even if the bond is ruinous. I only regret that Marcus's greed has tainted the reputation of the oil my family spent generations perfecting." Lucius found himself making a rare human connection. The Roman official was sickened by the pervasive corruption of the supply chain, and he recognized the look of genuine integrity in Elias's eyes, an integrity that seemed utterly absent in Marcus. Lucius paused, a strategic thought forming. "I am facing an immediate problem, Elias. Emperor Tiberius is sending a special envoy to inspect the Judean territories. He requires a ceremonial anointing oil of the absolute highest quality for the reception. The Sardinian filth Marcus has been supplying will not suffice. We require oil that speaks of the very heart of this land, rich and pure." Elias, sensing the shift, felt his heart pound not with greed, but with possibility. This was not the expected miracle of debt cancellation, but the miracle of a second chance, provision offered through work and purpose. "My last grove, Procurator, small as it is, still holds some of the oldest trees. If the oil is pressed correctly, handled with sanctity, it will be the purity you seek. But the presses are currently locked by Marcus's claim, and I have no coin for labor or storage." Lucius smiled, a thin, sharp expression directed entirely at Marcus. "It seems, Marcus, that your debtor holds the key to Rome's immediate diplomatic needs. We cannot have a failure in provision simply because of a local dispute over interest." Lucius stood, placing his hand firmly on the pile of Marcus's questionable ledgers. The air in the counting room crackled with silent battle. Marcus, terrified of a full Roman investigation into his tax evasion and supply fraud, realized he was trapped. Lucius Valerius, the cool, calculating procurator, held all the power. "The terms of the bond, Marcus," Lucius stated, his voice low and dangerous, "demand repayment, not permanent servitude of the family, which is a barbaric local custom that hinders our economy. This man, Elias, is capable of generating the required revenue, provided he is allowed to work. His debt must be restructured immediately, under terms acceptable to the dignity of a supplier now essential to Rome's honor." Marcus protested, sputtering about the accrued interest and the letter of the law. Lucius simply pointed to the ledgers. "The letter of the law protects Rome, Marcus. You have jeopardized a crucial diplomatic necessity, and your records are suspect. If I find one more irregularity, I will not only seize your assets for the tax debt, but I will strip you of your license and send you to face the governor." The threat was absolute. Marcus conceded with a bitter grimace. Lucius turned back to Elias. "Here is the provision, Elias. I will guarantee the purchase of 100 amphorae of your finest oil for the emperor's envoy at a superior market price, paid upon delivery. This contract is your collateral. Marcus will immediately release the claim on your presses and the remaining oil store, allowing you access to your tools and your trees. From the proceeds of the first shipment, a substantial portion must go directly to Marcus to begin paying down the principal debt, with a stipulated non-compounding interest rate. The remainder is for your labor and maintenance." Elias stood stunned. It was not a magical cancellation. The debt remained, large and daunting. But the crushing burden of fear and immediate slavery had been lifted. He had a path, a purpose, and protection. He had provision. He had come empty-handed, trusting only the shepherd, and the shepherd had provided a path through the valley of the shadow of debt, using the most unlikely of instruments. A meticulous, pragmatic Roman procurator who cared only about supply chain integrity and imperial pomp. Elias signed the new agreement, his hand steady. He looked at Marcus, now defeated and sweating profusely, and felt no triumph, only pity. He had been released from the bondage of financial fear. Marcus remained enslaved by his own greed. As Elias left the chamber, Lucius stopped him. "Elias, one final instruction. Do not fail to deliver the quality promised. Rome does not tolerate failure in state contracts." Elias nodded deeply. "I understand, Procurator. The quality will be pure, because my hands are now clean." He walked out of the fortress of debt and back into the sunlight of Bethany, a free man who still owed money, but who possessed a wealth that transcended silver and copper. The work began immediately, a frenzy of righteous, disciplined labor. Elias, Leah, and the children worked together in the small, neglected groves. The physical work was hard, but it was sanctified by the purpose, fulfilling the covenant of work and the promise of provision. Elias still repeated the psalm every morning, but now the words carried a different weight. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He didn't just understand it intellectually. He experienced the truth of it in the aching of his muscles and in the purity of the oil flowing from the presses. He realized that want was not the absence of possession, but the anxiety over future absence. Since the day he stood before Marcus and surrendered his fear, he had not wanted for peace, purpose, or protection. The physical needs, food, water, safety for his children, had been met through the unlikely intervention of Lucius. The greatest want, the spiritual emptiness, had been filled by the quiet, unwavering trust established in the wilderness. The miracle wasn't the disappearance of the debt, but the transformation of the burden. The debt became a motivator, a structure for disciplined work, instead of a paralyzing threat. He meticulously oversaw the pressing, ensuring that every drop of oil for the procurator's contract was of the highest possible purity, honoring the contract not just for Rome's sake, but for the sake of the trust he had rebuilt. The first shipment was delivered precisely on time, sealed and documented. Lucius Valerius, known for his cold efficiency, personally verified the quality, and finding it flawless, authorized the full payment. When Elias walked away from the Roman office that day, his tunic held the substantial sum needed to begin the repayment. He went directly to Marcus's house, not with dread, but with quiet dignity, and paid the first installment of the newly restructured debt. Marcus accepted the coin silently, the fear still lingering in his eyes, the fear that Elias no longer carried. Elias was no longer the merchant consumed by panic. He was the steward, guided by principle. He was paying his dues not out of servitude, but out of disciplined responsibility, knowing that the ultimate debt, the debt of fear and doubt, had already been satisfied. He used the remaining funds to clear small ancillary debts that had accumulated, providing clothes for his children and restoring the basic needs of his household. The prosperity was not instantaneous or glamorous, but it was secure, built upon the foundation of trust, provision, and hard-won humility. Elias knew his father would have approved, seeing that the oil was once again pure, and the hands that pressed it were clean, not just physically, but spiritually. He had learned that the path to abundance often runs directly through the terrifying valley of destitution, demanding only absolute, moment-by-moment reliance on the ultimate shepherd. The true provision was the peace that survived the storm. The debt remained a shadow, but the light of purpose shone stronger.